Alright, so, as you saw in my previous video, I have bought a GM Goodwrench small block Chevy, just a bare block, finish honed from General Motors and so on and so forth. And I wasn't all too impressed in that last video. I think I made that mighty clear. So now I'm at the end stages, and I'm going to give my God's honest review of this small block from General Motors. So, I bought some really nice, I mean, actually, to be honest with you, they are very, very nice, but they're not like trick flow. They're Pro Max heads, and I've got a review coming up for that in a little bit. It's basically going to be a whole series on building a small block Chevy and what I run into. You know, I'm 20 years old. I don't have a whole lot. I'm trying my best to avoid machinists because I know that most people are not the world's brightest. You know, don't get me wrong, I understand shit happens, but when shit happens and it costs $1,000 or $2,000, you know, you do your best to avoid those kinds of mistakes. And when it's a company that's just machining stuff on a daily basis and they have $20,000 or $40,000 or $80,000 or $100,000 worth of parts coming through in a day, to them, you know, screwing up one block is a little bit less of a big deal than it is to me. Even if they do or don't cut a full check, and that's, you know, I haven't had to experience that yet, but I've heard some horror stories. Anyways, I bolted on my really nice Pro Max heads onto this block, and then I measured the bore, the cylinder bore, with a bore gauge, and found that the cylinders were, I zeroed my bore gauge to 4 inches and 1 thousandths, so 4.001, and I found that the cylinders in one direction were at 0, all the way down to a millionth, which is awesome, and then in the opposite direction, in the same cylinder, so let's say we're going like this, now we're like this, in the same cylinder, all of a sudden that bore went from being 4 inches and 1 thousandths on the money, so reading 000 to infinity on the, or to whatever, the furthest the dial, the bore indicator can read, to 4 inches and 2 thousandths, all the way up to 4 inches and 2.5 thousandths. Now, that might not sound like a ton, but when you're talking about, when you buy pistons from a company like, in my case, KB, or UEM, they make their pistons specifically for that bore. So they build in the proper clearance based on that bore. So they're assuming that your bore is perfectly at 4 inches and 1 thousandth, for instance. Therefore, when they're done machining their pistons, they machine them to 3 inches and 99 thousandths, or 999 thousandths, or maybe 998 thousandths and 5 tenths. So that you can have their recommended 1 to 1.5. So actually it would be 399 thousandths to 399 thousandths and 5 tenths. I don't remember. I called them a long time ago. But they have a very, very limited range that they recommend with hypereutectic pistons, and they need basically between 1.5 to 2 thousandths of an inch piston to wall clearance. Otherwise, you wind up running into piston slap on the walls, and it's really not good for cast pistons because you'll crack the skirts over time. So as I'm measuring this GM Goodwrench block, I'm finding that it's so far out of round that, number one, there's no way that this engine will ever last. I mean, sure, 40, 50,000 miles, probably. It probably won't be a happy 40, 50,000 miles, but it'll run. And that's good and all, but man, if you're dumping $4,000 or $5,000 or even $6,000, $7,000 and you're just trying to get a good block, you know, but you're not trying to break the bank and build a race engine with a dart block or something like that with their little M's or a blueprint block or yada yada yada. If you're trying to just go the economic route but put some really high quality parts in it, like for instance forged pistons, forged rods, forged yada yada yada, or H-beam rods, and a forged crank and roller cam and the whole aluminum heads and 9 yards, the whole thing. You start doing that and you've got an engine that's worth $4,000 but in 50,000 miles has to be rebuilt because borderline needs the whole entire block to be replaced or machined by somebody that knows what they're doing. I mean, number one, you're lucky to find a machinist like that because they're hard to find. Number two, you having a company as big, as powerful, and as financially well off as General Motors give you a product like what I got with absolutely no verification on any of the machine surfaces. No information given to me whatsoever that the thing was even QC'd at all, except for some chalk marks that were not defined to me at all. It's really disappointing to the point where I'm returning the block. So the block costs on Jegs right now about $980. It's a cheap block. You get what you pay for. Unfortunately, I should have spent more time doing my research, but I made the mistake. Hopefully somebody watches this and doesn't make the same mistake. It's a little bit of a monologue. Sorry, it's going to run a hot minute. But so with getting absolutely no information whatsoever from General Motors, and then Jegs telling me that it should be fine. Most people just punch these blocks out anyways. It gets to be like, well, the whole purpose of this was for me to not punch the block out, so, let me see how round it is. I tossed the heads on it, flipped the block over, checked how round they were with the heads bolted on, which, if you're wondering, would tell you whether or not, when they machined the block, if they put torque plates on it, and then bored it with the torque plates, because basically when you bolt and torque on heads, it twists the block. Not a lot, but it does it enough to move it a thou in one direction, which I definitely saw because the bore never read 4 inches and 1 thou dead nuts in any direction, at any angle, or any depth when I measured it with nothing on it. So having done that and seeing the numbers change so drastically and then be very, very far out of round tells me that they don't even take the extra, I'm going to say, 5 to 10 minutes to bolt on some torque plates when they final machine, final bore, and final hone and hatch mark the fucking the cylinders. It's pathetic. So block's going back. I wrote a review on Jegs. It's pretty pathetic. I'm not impressed with this block at all. I should have known better when I looked at the block. The box. I didn't even have to open the box yet. I looked at the box and it said made in Mexico, and I said all this in the last video. Man, I tell you what, sometimes you get a gut feeling and you oughta follow through with it, because that shit, I mean, it had it cast into the block. It had the 5.7 liter cast into the block, and I get it, that's just visual aesthetic crap, but it don't sit right. Anyways, did some research and found that Dart makes a line of blocks called SHP blocks. They're called the Special High Performance blocks. They cost an extra $600. And in Chevrolet, the small block Chevy's instance, the block has splayed main caps, 4-bolt splayed main caps for the middle 3 main caps. The furthest back one and then the furthest forward one are just 2 bolts. They have extremely thick wall the whole 9 yards. It's a nice block. I haven't gotten it yet because I'm returning the old one, so I don't have the money for it quite yet. But for $1,500, you can save yourself a serious headache. So this is my buyer beware. If you're buying a GM Goodwrench crate engine from fucking Mexico, you better not expect that engine to run very strong for very long.